starting right on time.
Benvinguts a la segona sessió de denominació d'origen a Europa, aquí en aquest acte que forma part, com sabeu, de la celebració del tricentenari organitzat per l'Ajuntament. Una vegada més gràcies a l'organització per permetre'ns aquest luxe, que vol dir que avui ens acompanyi aquí Susan George. Explicar-vos per què Susan George és aquí avui, igual que ho vam fer amb Bauman. Noam Chomsky diu que els polítics d'Occident, si fessin les coses com han de fer, haurien de tenir els llibres de Susan George a la tauleta de nit, com si fos la Bíblia. Avui sabreu per què, molts de vosaltres segur que coneixeu la trajectòria de Susan George. Ella va néixer a Ohio, però és una europea no només de nacionalitat sinó de convicció, i avui ens explicarà què significa Europa per ella. Teniu a fora els llibres de la Susan George, els qui no els conegueu. Sabeu que dues obres de referència que són avui damunt del debat públic. Un és el primer Informe Lugano de l'any 99 i ara el més recent, tot just l'any passat es va publicar el segon Informe Lugano, en la que Susan George, i avui desenvoluparà una part del pensament que ja en aquest informe, el títol original és How to Win the Class War, que s'ha traduït amb ens desfarem de la democràcia, o com desfer-nos de la democràcia, que és un matís que jo crec que ella voldrà aportar avui en aquesta sessió. Quina és la riquesa del pensament de Susan George? Això ho anireu veient a mesura que anem avançant, però té molt a veure amb la seva convicció ferma de que Europa, si aconsegueix posar en valor el coneixement i la unitat, pot convertir-se en la veritable clau de canvi del que necessitem ara a nivell global, a nivell de món. Ella és presidenta de la Junta Directiva del Transnational Institute. El Transnational Institute és una organització acadèmica arreu del món formada per acadèmics independents que treballen per la justícia social. És presidenta d'honor de l'Associació per la Taxació de Transaccions i per l'Ajuda als Ciutadans, ATAC, a França. Com sabeu, és una persona que va estar molt temps involucrada a Greenpeace i en aquests moments, naturalment, ella amb seu amb la seva base d'operacions a París. Ara em deia, li preguntava, viatges molt? I em deia, vaig a Brussel·les, que és una hora anar i tornar, però realment la seva feina és una feina a nivell transnacional d'intentar posar en valor el que ella considera que és fonamental, que és l'Alter Summit, una cimera alternativa per solucionar els problemes del món i aconseguir que hi hagi una justícia social que la ciutadania recuperi el sentit de la democràcia. I és d'això del que parlarem. Teniu els llibres a l'abast. Ella està disposada després, quan acabi la sessió, si voleu, que us els signi i, per tant, quan acabi la sessió, que com sempre ja us ho vam dir l'altre dia amb el professor Bauman, serà d'una hora i mitja, si voleu després podeu acostar-vos i ella us el signarà i la podreu saludar. Però, welcome to Barcelona, Susan George.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, as always. And thank you to all of you for coming along. It's good to see you.
The first question, I was telling the audience that you are a strong defender of Europe, what Europe means. But you are worried about the Europe that we have today.
Yes.
And you sometimes say, Europe is not what it should be. Why is that? What's happening?
Well, what's happening is a very long story. I think we need more than an hour and a half for that. But let's start with this famous crisis, because everyone thought that things were going extremely well until 2007, 2008. And Spain was a particular case because it really was the bursting of a bubble, which was the housing and building bubble. So that's a bit different from the rest of Europe. But every single country was hit very hard by a crisis which began in the United States and in Britain. Those were the two epicenters of the crisis. Now, there would have been ways to emerge from this crisis a lot faster than we did. But instead, what they have allowed to happen is for the economy to go down and spiral so that we are almost in a situation of deflation, not inflation, but a moment when prices start to fall because nobody can buy anything because of austerity. because people think, well, I'll get it cheaper later, so I won't buy it now. Investors then stop investing because the shops aren't selling anything. Everything begins to diminish. You will remember that the Japanese went through this for decades. They're only just emerging, and maybe not even now. So, two ways to look at this. One is actually two economics Nobel Prize winners whom I admire a great deal, Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz. Their attitude is, these Europeans, they don't understand anything about economics. Let's write and tell them how to fix this, how to invest now, how to spend, how to keep on developing Europe. You can believe that if you want. They're not exactly saying the Europeans are stupid, but that's what it comes down to. Either you can believe that, or you can look at what is actually happening to people in Europe, particularly in Southern Europe, and Spain is a very good example. And what is actually happening is that people are becoming more and more the victims of an extremely cruel neoliberal system in which the people at the very top of society, the very rich, and those who have not just capital in financial terms, but also have social capital, they have knowledge capital, they have friends capital, they know everybody. I call these people the Davos class, and they exist in all of our countries. And they are dictating what the policies are going to be. It's the transnational corporations, it's the banks. The governments are in their pockets. They do more or less exactly what these Davos class people tell them to do. And I believe, and I'm sorry if this sounds too harsh, but I believe that they have said to themselves, this is a very good opportunity to claw back all of the things that people have gained in the last 60 or 70 years. In Europe, in France, Germany, and so on, more or less since the end of the Second World War. In Spain, it would be after Franquismo, but they're clawing these things back that people have gained through democratic efforts and through developing a democracy and through struggles. That's over.
That's when it comes to the point in which you said, you know, we are in a crisis which has been determined and defined, and really we are in a new chapter of a class struggle, the class war. But how democracy can be regained by citizenship? How can citizens recover their control over democracy?
Well, that too is a very big question, and we have not really exhausted your first question, so I'm sure we'll come back to it in different ways. But how can citizens reclaim democracy? I don't believe that anyone by himself or herself can do this. I think it is only by being together. You can take your choice of what you want to be together in, but it's got to be either a political party or an association or an ecological pressure group like Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace, or some sort of association which has the capacity to help you understand what's going on and knowledge which will help you to act and act in a strategic way. The second stage, once people have found their proper place, what is my partnership? What am I really interested in? That's where the individual says, well, I think what I think is most serious is jobs, or the most serious is climate change, or whatever. You know, there isn't a good or a bad choice here. You join with other people. The second stage is that then you must seek out people who maybe don't agree with you on 100%, But if your concerns are like that, and their concerns are like this, that means that you agree on a great deal. And you can build on what you agree on inside the same country. And that is why an organization, I know France best, of course, because that's where I live, but an organization like ATTAC has made alliances with Friends of the Earth, with the unions, with many organizations which have, like Oxfam, that have their own preoccupations, their own specialties. However, on certain issues, we all work together because we have the same enemies, we have the same adversaries. And then I would say the third stage, which is only just beginning, is to recognize that however much we do, we can't win in one country. I think lots of people thought that by demonstrating and doing the wonderful demonstrations you've had in Spain, the Indignados, but the Indignados with a lot of other people, millions, you brought out 10% of the Portuguese population. There were 1 million people in the streets. Nothing happens. You know, I mean, it's very depressing.
And then what?
So the answer to that is, okay, now we can't just be content with making big coalitions in our own countries. That remains important, of course, because our own governments could still do a lot of things differently. But we have to go beyond that. We have to think of ourselves as Europeans. Yes, we are Catalans and Spaniards or not. Yes, we are, but we are also Europeans. So I feel French and European, and I feel at home in many, many places in Europe, and now this is beginning to happen.
And which values, people who is listening to us that feels Catalan and European, which values do we share with Germans, Greeks, British, Italians? Which values do we share that could make possible to think of a common political party based on social movements that would bring us together to fight for social justice?
Well, I would start with history. I mean, I think we have to think in terms of how we got to where we are today and why are we here. I hope I will say some things that will offend the government or will offend some people in the audience, or, you know, I mean, maybe if we tried to do this 250 years ago, we would have all been clapped in prison, and for certain things we would have been burnt at the stake in the public square.
Cut in pieces.
Right.
Cut in pieces and send it all over.
Okay. That doesn't happen anymore, or it happens in different ways. But democracy isn't something that you have and then you've got it. It's something that you've got to keep doing every day, because otherwise you can lose it, and that's what's happening now. So let's go way back. Let's go back to and here again, I know the French and the English-American side better, but certainly the values of the Enlightenment are extremely important. In the American Revolution, and they got lots of their ideas from the French, the values were of democratic government, constitutional government, the rule of law, the freedoms that come with that, which are freedom of speech, of worship, of religion, the freedom of the press, very important to you. These freedoms which were enshrined in the United States in the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 articles of amendments to the Constitution. In France, it was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of 1789, the year of the Revolution. But these were very new ideas. They were revolutionary ideas. They still are in many ways, because we still have to keep defending them. So those are the values, I think, which are worth defending and which are being challenged every day. Look at Edward Snowden, who tries to preserve freedom of speech and of information. Look what happens to him. He's exiled. lots of people in the United States military establishment dream of shooting him in the streets of Moscow. You know?
But that's exactly what people is thinking, and they are going on the streets, they are protesting, they are saying, you mentioned the el moviment dels indignats, and people see that nothing happens, and that the states brand their laws and say, we cannot move from this position because the Troika, the European Commission is telling us, or the Monetary Funding is telling us what to do. People feel that these values are not protected anymore by the states.
And that's true. That is true, and that is partly because the governments, as I mentioned but very briefly, are really now governing on behalf of the very largest corporations and the banks. Now, I have to admit that I was quite naive because I really believed that after the crisis of 2008, and once we had really seen what this was doing, and once the Troika moved in particular, I really thought that the governments have got to do something about this. They cannot just let the people collapse, you know. They can't allow this carnage and this unemployment and these terrible social outcomes. And I thought, you know, they're going to cut the banks in half. They will have to separate the elements that allowed the crisis to begin with. They're going to have to get finance under control. They're going to have to tax the very big companies more, etc., etc. I was dead wrong. You know, I mean, I just didn't get it. And so I changed my mind quite quickly. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book you mentioned, the second Lugano report, because I wanted to show what they have actually managed to do, and I do it by congratulating them. My working group is saying, you really did it right. You've made all these victories. You've managed to get all these things back, and we didn't believe you could do it, you know. So I'm writing a satire here, but they really have won. And that is something we have to really attack together. And that I think we can do, but maybe we'll talk in a little while about the transatlantic treaty. I hope so, because that's an example of where people from both sides of the Atlantic can come together, but Europeans can come together, because if that goes through, sorry, that will be the triumph of non-democratic rule. And just one thing on this question, when you say it doesn't seem as though we can do anything, I quote a French early 17th century philosopher, La Boétie, and he said, they seem so tall because we are on our knees.
Well, you said something that probably is scaring the audience, to say they have won the war.
Well, I don't think they have completely won, and history is never over. Let's remember that. We shouldn't decide what history is going to be like. And I know so many people who are in this fight in one way or another that actually I am not pessimistic, except perhaps in the short term. Mm-hmm. For the longer term, I am optimistic, because I'm getting on in years now, and I remember the 80s and the early 90s when everybody thought neoliberalism was great. Let the markets decide. The market is wise. The market is efficient. The market will make us rich. What we need is growth, infinite growth. You know. Everybody thought that, well, all the smart young men didn't want to become lawyers and doctors or professors or judges. They wanted to become traders, and lots of them did.
Well, one of the consequences of this crisis, and you mentioned in the second Lugano reports, you said this class war, it will be won by the commissioners and by the financial power, if middle classes get diminished, and if human rights get diminished and democracy get demolished.
Well,
that's where we are when we talk about austerity.
They have to keep some people able to buy things. That's where their big contradiction comes, because I spoke about the risk of deflation, where nobody can afford to do anything and everybody's waiting and not contributing to the economy. And the wealth that is being made, because wealth is being created, is all going to the financial sector. Paul Krugman showed that wealth, which had been created since the beginning of the crisis, had gone for 96% into the financial economy, not into the real economy, where real goods and real services are sold and traded between real people. It had all gone into this casino again. That's something else that scares me. I mean, maybe we're going to have a very scary evening because...
Hopefully not.
Well, no, but I mean, there's a lot of optimism also. But I think if we're not aware of the dangers, then we're not in good shape to fight also.
You've mentioned that the solution for this Europe, for this hope that you have that Europe will not lose this war, this class war, is knowledge and unity. You mentioned unity, thinking of social movements, trades, organizations, social organizations, and so on and so forth. But what about knowledge? Where is knowledge today in this society in which mass media are controlled by corporations and people is less and less, even with social nets, less and less informed?
Well, there I have to say, not everything is controlled by the mass media. You're not controlled by the mass media, and you've got 6 hours on the radio every morning.
Yes,
she has to get up at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
So, no, I mean, there are organizations like ATTAC which specialize in what we call popular education. It's true that it isn't as easy as it used to be. When I started off, we said, U.S. get out of Vietnam, and people agreed with you or they didn't agree, but at least they knew what you were talking about. If you said, stop apartheid now, people understood what that meant. And now if I say there is this terrible U.S.-EU treaty which is going to make a huge difference and which will allow the largest transnational corporations to take over in many, many ways, and it takes me quite a while to explain what it is. So you have to have some sort of education which takes in the complexities of things. I'm sorry. And you have to have people who specialize in trying to do that. That's what my work is. That is what I try to do every day. So I'm very glad you asked the question, because I think that's what the Transnational Institute does all the time, too. So there are plenty of sources of alternative knowledge. We don't have to just watch the television news on whatever channel is the closest to the government. Although, of course, many people do, unfortunately. But an audience which comes to an event like this one is an audience which is informed, which wants to be informed, and which will inform itself, I think. But knowledge has to be the basis, because Europe is claiming to be democratic, and there are many ways that we can show that this isn't true. But I give you just one. To prepare for this treaty, we have friends in the Corporate Europe Observatory. If you go to the web, you go www.corporateeurope.org. Terrific people. They spend their lives finding out which huge companies are doing what in what area. And what they found was that the Commission had called 127 meetings to prepare this treaty between the US and the EU. Of 127 meetings, 93% were with the largest corporations and their lobbyists. Only 7 or 8 were with environmentalists or trade unionists or other people that the Commission consulted once in a while. But they're completely on the side of the wrong people. And it took my friends 6 months to get this information, which was heavily censored. Lots of things were crossed out. So, but it's valuable to know that. It's valuable to know that the commission, you know what they call us, or they don't call us citizens. They call us stakeholders. This in French, for the translators, heaven knows how you translate it into Catalan. In French, it's partie prenante. But you're not a citizen, no. But unless they tell you that you're a partie prenante, you're not one. You have no voice at all. So you can be a partie prenante if you're a trade unionist. I'm not a partie prenante because I don't have a stake in this thing. A stake in English is always to do with money or a horse or betting something. Or
well, that's when citizens doesn't have the conscience of being citizens and are consumers.
Well, and they treat us like
consumers.
Yes, consumers. That's what we are, consumers. And some of us are stakeholders, but only if the Commission says that we're stakeholders.
And in this context, you've said sometimes governments could do more. They can do more than they do.
Oh, of course.
First thing.
They could, yeah.
And identity policies are a way of distracting people from not knowing what can they do together, because we can do things
I see
together.
what you're referring to. In this book, is it that one? Let's show the people what it is. This book is a satire. This is what I call a factual fiction. It's not the truth. But what I say is that there's a group of commissioners. These people are worried about the future of capitalism. You said this in the introduction. And they call together these think tank people. And the think tank people have written this report. And they are the ones who say that. But they are saying identity politics is very helpful, because if you can keep people focused on their identity, either as a
religion,
on their religion, I'm a Muslim, or I'm a Catholic, or I'm a Jew, or their sexuality, I'm a homosexual, or I'm a lesbian.
Or it's about who you are.
Who you are. And this, I'm sorry, also sometimes goes as far as making it the most important thing, to the point of fanaticism among some people in Belgium who belong to the Vlaams bloc, the Flemish bloc, because being Flemish is the most important thing to them in politics. This is fairly frequent in the north part of Italy. It's also the same way. So whether you're focusing on your sexuality or your gender or your religion or whatever else might distinguish you from other people, that's good, because that keeps you separate from the others. But if the government doesn't want you to stop, and they'll give you something now and then, because if all these people were together and talking about the things that affect us all, I mean, this would be a formidable bloc. But if they remain focused on the immediate, the immediate care, I can understand that, but that shouldn't be the whole picture of a person's life.
People who is listening to you must be thinking, look, now in Catalonia there's a strong will of the majority of the society to define again what's the relationship with Spain. They want to vote, and they've expressed themselves through the streets, like in a very strong social movement. And in our parliament, they vote. Majority of the political parties have decided to go for a referendum and decide if they want to be part of Spain. It's not only a matter of identity, it's a matter of not feeling attached to the state for a part of our society, and they feel that they are not respected in terms of democratic rights.
No, well, I think that's perfectly legitimate. It's always legitimate to demand more democratic tools in order to know what is the will of the people. You don't know what the will of the people is unless you ask them. So some sort of vote, in that case, is a normal and logical thing to do, and nobody should try to prevent a referendum. Now, for example, in France, when we voted no to the treaty, the constitutional treaty in 2005, it started out in January that we would have 30%. But people all over France got together, they made collectives. There were 900 or 1,000 of these collectives all over the country. And the people had bought the Constitution. There has never been a more boring text than the Constitution. It was the #1 bestseller. It was crazy. My own children, my son and his wife were like this because one was for the yes and one was for the no. It was a terrific debate. And then we voted no. And since then, no referendum, no, not allowed. It's only the Irish who can vote now because they know we would do it again. So I think it's perfectly legitimate. It's a different discussion if it's to say, yes, leave Spain. That's a completely different discussion. And I don't think we need to get into that because I'm not a Catalan and I don't know what I would do. On the whole, I think it is better to get more autonomy, but not to leave a major state like Spain. That's just, but we don't have to go into that.
This Europe that we started talking earlier on when we started this conversation, this Europe, which is in economic terms, which has this European Commission that decides without much intervention of citizens. Although now we are going to this 25th of May election in which we will choose who is going to be the president of the European Commission.
Right.
Could be useful to have a European constitution, not the treaties, but a European constitution in which we could protect these values that you were mentioned, in which we could say if we want this transatlantic treaty, which can undermine precisely these values of democracy.
Well, we should have, certainly every time there's a constitutional change, of the importance of the one that came around in 2005, yes, there should be a referendum. We can't have a referendum all the time. The treaty is going to be ratified only by the European Parliament, and they can only say yes or no to the whole thing. They can't say, I like this part, but I don't want that. So the Americans are going to be able to amend it, probably, because the president always asks for just a yes or no vote. But I don't think Obama will get that. So probably the Americans will be able to put in amendments. They might stop it that way. We don't have that democratic power. So can I ask a question of the audience?
Of course.
How many of you voted last time in the European elections?
Quants vau votar a les eleccions europees? Quite a lot.
That looks good.
But that's not representative. In the year 2009, if I am not wrong now, I am talking by memory,
right. No, you're right.
it was 38% of the
we had
population.
40%. We were,
38,
but that's too many abstentions.
38, 39. I'm not sure about
Are
this.
you thinking about it at all? Are you thinking about these elections at all? Do you plan to go and vote this time?
Anireu a votar o què en aquestes eleccions del 25 de maig? Déu-n'hi-do, no? No tots, eh? No us veig a tots molt animats, eh? You're not very keen on going.
I'm asking everybody here to go and vote in the European elections.
Yeah, but they know what are they going to vote. I mean, they really, we are going to decide whether Jean-Claude Juncker or...
No, you've got Alexei Tsipras. And vote for him. No, Alexei Tsipras is terrific. The Green candidate looks pretty good too. The Green candidate is a German Green, very seasoned girl. She seems to be okay, you know. I mean, I'm not telling you how to vote, but you don't have to take the old
You're
war
not telling
horses.
us what to vote, you're telling us who to vote.
No, well, I added another person. I've given you two choices. No, but vote for who you like, but vote, because if we don't do that, and many people won't, because they think, you know, who cares, it's not worth it, can't change anything, but we really do have to make ourselves heard.
Okay, but what they are thinking is, yes, but Angela Merkel is going to be leading Europe anyway.
Not necessarily.
How come? How
Not
do we change
necessarily.
this?
Okay, something I just read in the paper coming here. The Germans, for the first time, are going to balance their budget. They will have no budget deficit in 2015. How did they do that? By making a lot of cuts in investments. So the schools won't be as good, the hospital health system won't.
Just like
They're not investing in a whole lot of things that used to get money. The details are not in the report I read, but Mr. Schauble is there showing that his budget is going to be, you know, the lines are very clear. Well, I thought that's the start of the decline of Germany. It really is. If you don't invest in the future as a government, you start to have a decline. Now, let's say if the Germans go too far, and if we have another euro crisis, which is possible, and I'll tell you how in a moment if you're interested, then it will be absolute financial chaos. And nobody is going to come out a winner. Because if everybody goes back to the peso, the peseta, the guilder, the mark, the franc, the lira, this will not just be chaos between Europeans and between European businesses, which are now linked like that, but the German Deutschmark would be the only one that would go like double or triple what it is today. The Germans would no longer sell a single automobile, or maybe, you know, 2 or 3, but they would never be able to sell at the price that the Deutschmark would become compared to the other monies of Europe. So, you know, I mean, nothing is written. Let's remember that. History is not written. And the Germans, they're not, you know, I mean, it's like Krugman said, these Europeans are stupid and they don't know what they're doing.
Yes.
I don't think the Germans are stupid, and I think they will recognize a certain number of things. And after all, they did let Mario Draghi say, whatever it takes, we're going to save the euro. Now, maybe he's not doing it in the right way, etc. But I think it would be a real disaster to allow Europe to crumble and separate. I think it's a hard call, because it's very difficult to say that we have to change Europe from inside without destroying what's been done so far, when there is so much that's been done so far that's bad. This is a very hard thing to do, but I think I will not take personally the moral responsibility to say, oh yes, let's leave the euro, let's go back to a national currency. Because although I'm not an economist, I don't think it is possible to have an orderly exit from the euro. Any country, including Greece, that said, okay, sorry, we can't do anything more, we're leaving the euro, this would provoke such panic in Europe. People would be lining up outside to get their money out of the bank, including in Spain, in Portugal. There would be huge chaos. And, you know, after Lehman Brothers failed, they're still studying, they're still sorting out who owes what to whom, because there were thousands of correspondents who either owed money to Lehman or Lehman owed them. It's taking years to sort out. Can I tell you a story about mathematics?
Yes.
It's just a story. There's these 3 mathematicians at the Zurich Polytechnic who wrote this wonderful scientific paper. You don't have to be able to read the equations. I can't do math at all, but the paper itself is about the businesses which are the most concentrated and the most interlinked in the world. They start with this huge database of thousands of companies. They have a really good methodology for seeing who is linked to whom, who's got stock in whom, who's got board directors, or interlinked. Then they bring this down to 700 and some companies, which together possess indirectly 80% of all of the whole of the database. It's like a map of the sky where you have big stars, you have great big suns, sometimes you have a supernova, which is really huge, and then they bring this down and down and down, and finally they get to the 50 most interconnected companies in the world. And this is what these mathematicians call the knife edge property, what we would say in French, on the edge of the razor. Mm-hmm. And if everything is going well in the economy, looks great, very robust, fine. But if things are not going very well, and one of those companies fails, then all hell breaks loose, because they are so closely connected that they infect each other. And it's like lining up dominoes to go, here are all the dominoes, and you push one, and it goes, and they all fall down. Now, the kicker on this is, the real part of the story, is that those 50 companies, except for two, except for Walmart and the Chinese Petroleum Group, are all financial companies. They're all banks or big hedge funds or big financial services or insurance companies. And if one thing goes wrong with any of them, it's Lehman multiplied by 100.
Well, that's what
that's one of the things that keeps me awake at night.
Well, that's what I want to ask, because they have convinced us that they needed to rescue the banks, mm-hmm. because otherwise, that you've just explained so nicely would happen. But these people who is here is paying the rescue of the banks, and the credit is not coming down to families or business. No. So it's not working. And they have convinced us that those.
And that is why the Spanish people are paying back every cent, because the banks are not paying back anything. The promoters, the promoters of all the building bubble, they're not paying back anything. In general, in Europe, when the crisis happened, the whole GDP of Europe, on an average, not in each country, but on average, it went down by 5%. Governments had to compensate for that. First, they had to bail out the banks. They had to save the financial system. Then they had to try to invest to bring up the economy, that 5% lost. Then there were so many unemployed people that they had to pay unemployment benefits to those people. So pretty soon they had nothing left. So they say, well, what do we do? Do we tax the banks? Do we separate the banks in two so that this cannot happen again? Do we say the commercial banks on one side and the investment banks, not the same thing at all? Do we tax the largest companies? Do we have a wealth tax on the wealthiest families? No, none of that. None of that happened. So what is the alternative? You are the alternative.
Well,
I am the alternative. We pay.
They are the alternative. Citizenship is the alternative, but they feel that political parties in the democratic institutions they are not managing to convert the citizenship, the citizens' feelings, fight against this
that's true.
Davos class.
That's true.
How do we?
They're right.
But give us a clue how to solve this problem.
Well, look, I know very little about Spanish politics.
Well, that happens
But it happens everywhere.
Everywhere.
One answer, and this is dangerous in my view, is going to be happening in France where the National Front is going to get a lot of votes because people say to themselves, I voted for the socialists are neoliberals, I vote for the right, they are neoliberals. At least the National Front is proposing something different. You see this in so many places. I think it's partly politics because we cannot get on without the state, so we have to take political parties into consideration. I don't want the companies to be running everything, and the companies don't want to run everything either. They need the state to do certain things. They want to direct what happens, but they don't want to do it themselves. Again, the only answer, and I'm sorry I sound like a broken record or something,
No.
but is we have to be together in different associations. We have to learn how to make coalitions, even with people we don't agree with on 100%. We have to bring together ecologists, the peace movement, the different interest groups, even small and medium enterprise, because they are suffering. They have their own federations. The smaller farmers who risk a great deal in the future, especially once more if this treaty passes, those small farmers are going to be wiped out so fast. Like Mexico with the NAFTA. Mexico lost 2 million small farmers just like that because American corn came pouring in. And it is really a question. I don't say this can happen overnight, but how do we get out of it? Well, in France we had some hope because François Hollande had made this really good speech saying, my enemy is finance and here's what I'm going to do. And then passes a law which they had hearings in the parliament, and one of the bankers who was there testifying, and he was honest enough to say, well, go ahead, pass your law. This is only going to affect 1% of my business, instead of, really getting the banks under control. And everything he promised to do, he's not doing. But that's one reason a lot of people will either abstain or they will vote for the National Front. And personally, this is the first time in my life that I have ever joined a political party, because it's a new one, and it was founded from an association I belonged to before, and it's called Nouvelle Donne, which means New Deal in French, because it is based on Rooseveltian type policies, and because I think we have to have a chance for the European elections to explain to people that there are solutions. We don't have to have this huge unemployment. Yours is twice as big as ours, but ours is, believe me, we have an awful lot of precarious.
22%.
22%, well, ours is 11, but that is an understatement because they fudge the figures, and there's an awful lot of poor people and an awful lot of people who are on short-term contracts and precarious work. They have, today they have something, tomorrow they might not. Terribly stressful. The young people, well, everybody knows the story of the young people. You can have 6 years of post-high school, post-lycée studies, and you still, don't get a job. So there are ways to do something about this. I mean, you can say it's crazy, but it's not so crazy to say, why don't we all work 32 hours? Everybody takes a 5% or 10% cut in salary. Everybody works 32 hours, and then, or 30, and then, that you can hire other people. Why don't we have a huge investment in an ecological transition? There have been innumerable studies that say that that is the way to create jobs. You change the whole energy system, you change the whole housing system, you have a complete refitting of every house in the country to make sure that it's got heating and air conditioning, and we know how to do these things. It's not a technical problem.
Well, you mentioned Roosevelt. You mentioned in 1933, when the Glass-Steagall Act
That's right.
that changed things
Yeah.
and said, look, banks, you are going to separate your investment policies from the credit to the families, and we are to cut the rules that allow you to speculate. Roosevelt did it.
No,
And now, with the crisis of 2008, nobody did
Nobody
anything
did it,
similar.
exactly.
That means the politicians now are not really having the power to do that.
it
Or
doesn't
they
mean,
don't want to.
It doesn't mean they don't have the power, it means they don't have the guts. They don't have the guts. And a lot of them are in the pocket of the banks or the transnationals. And here the media, I would say, are guilty. We have talk shows all the time where somebody comes on the air and he's an economist and he's got a nice suit and he looks really, and he says, I'm from
I can think of
University
somebody.
XY, you know, I'm from
Yeah.
this or that university. And he never says, and I'm on the board of the BNP Paribas or the Société Générale or some other bank. And he never says that he has, X fingers in X numbers of pies that he is making money from. He's not just a university professor, he's got ties to, and there's so many of them that are like that. That's why I like in France, the Économistes Atterrés. There is an association of alternative economists in Spain. I'm sorry, I forget their name, but we've got a coalition of Spanish, Portuguese, German, French, and Italian economists, and all working together. And we've got a conference in Brussels next week where people are going to talk about exactly the sorts of questions that you're asking.
But, Mrs. George, 1 year
Call
ago...
me Susan, please. That's
Susan.
no, it's more friendly.
1 year ago, you signed a manifesto for a global democracy. Do you remember the one?
I've signed a lot of things,
Yeah.
but probably I did, yes.
with Bauman and Senate and a lot of...
Oh, yeah, sure. No, I would sign something.
Sabater
If
and-
Richard Sennett signs it. Richard
Yeah.
Richard is the husband of Saskia.
Yes, yes, yes.
So you
Saskia
can
Sassen.
take me down here and
No,
put up Saskia.
This is
because-
yours. This is yours. From time to time, it comes some of
Well,
your
you should all
thoughts.
come and listen to Saskia as well.
And little has been achieved, even if intellectual, like politicians and economic alternative, the organization in which you work do things. Doesn't seem that politicians feel compelled to think
Yeah.
of an alternative way of developing democracy.
Yeah, okay.
I'm pushing on
I know
you
what
on
you're
that
talking
because-
about. It
because-
takes a very long time because for the last 30 years, the neoliberals, I assume everybody knows what this means.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
The neoliberals have had a very successful strategy of pushing through their ideas. We're back at knowledge now. We're back to communications and knowledge. And they began this in the 1950s, but it's only in the 70s that this began to take off. And then it really comes to power with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in 1980. What did they do? They understood that if you want to win, you have to use the cultural tools that Antonio Gramsci told us about. You have to set up cultural hegemony because you're not going to win through repression, through force, that doesn't work. You have to get people's heads to think the way you want them to think. And Gramsci said to do this, you have to make the long march through the institutions. Now, what did they do? What did the neoliberals do? First, they had a lot of money because there were a lot of large fortunes, and there still are, which were prepared to fund this kind of work. They funded university professors. They created new chairs in prestigious universities of law and economics. They funded publications. They funded everything from the scholarly journal at the top to the campus newspaper. They funded the media, they bought media, they did everything that they could to go wherever ideas were developed and disseminated. And they did this very successfully. So that now, at least in the United States, where it is the worst, you don't just say he's a trade unionist. You say he's a trade unionist thug. He's a criminal. He's going to, you have a whole vocabulary that they have changed because they have been able to name things. And they have been able to make these names stick. And so they are dominating the discourse. And now we have this discourse. That's why I get angry when I hear stakeholder, for instance. Damn it, I'm not a stakeholder. You don't give me the right to be a stakeholder, and I'm a citizen, and I should have a voice. I don't like governance. I want government. Governance is something that can go, that's what the World Bank uses to say they have to keep paying, the southern countries have to keep paying their debt because their governance is bad. You can't define that. And on and on. So now we are stuck with this idea of growth. Growth is totally idiotic. If you look at the growth of Europe over the last 20 years, it goes down and down like that. So now that it's practically invisible, we're not going to have the kind of growth that China has. China isn't going to have the kind of growth that China had. And as Kenneth Boulding said, a wonderful ecological economist, he said, anybody who thinks that economic activity can grow infinitely on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. You cannot do it. So we have to think of something else, which is why I say the ecological transition. You do the same things, you have the same comfort, but you do it without producing huge amounts of CO2 and without killing off all of the biodiversity of the planet. You do it by publicizing the studies which have been done now. You know something? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, but this has just come to me. Austerity is a lie. It is a huge lie, and we can prove this. There is no study done by any economist that says austerity can work. If by working we mean it can provide growth of a good kind and employment. It can't. Now, even the IMF, even the International Monetary Fund has published 3 papers authorized by the chief economist. One of them he wrote himself, Olivier Blanchard, and they all say that austerity will make inequality grow, that it will make unemployment last longer, especially long-term unemployment, and that it is going to be a total disaster. This is known. There were 2 economists who said, Reinhardt and Rogoff, who wrote that if your debt got to 90% of your GDP, you know the story, then you would start a downward spiral. Well, it turned out that their figures were absolutely wrong. They'd got the commas wrong and the zeros wrong and the Excel document wrong and so on.
And a student discovered
And a student, and the PhD student discovered it, and he took it to his professor and he said, you better get in touch with the authors, and he did, and finally the authors admitted this. But that's not the only paper that has been discredited. There's another one by a couple of Italians. I mean, every time somebody writes a paper that defends austerity, so now it collapses. So now there are even people who are close to the European Commission who are writing things to say, this can't work. Now, by that we have to mean that working is to cure the ills of society as it is now. And that's another reason that I say you can believe that you can, but it's working for some people. And it is working. but that depends for whom.
Even with everything you've said in this conversation, you believe that Europe can make the change and not Brazil or India or China. Europe will be the key factor for this change, for this global change, really?
Well, I used to think that Europe, look, I mean, let me start by saying I don't want to say we've just been this sweetness and light of the Enlightenment, you know. I mean, Europe has been pretty horrible in many, many ways. We had the two greatest wars in the history of the world, killed more people, colonialism, absolutely terrible stories, the Holocaust. You know, I mean, the history, particularly of the 19th and 20th century, is not a beautiful history. So I'm not discounting all of these horrors. What I am saying is that Europe is also the place which not only invented a perfectly fantastic culture, I mean, go out of here and walk for 10 minutes and you'll see what I mean, and this is true everywhere, and I know when I'm in Europe, I'm sure you do too, and when you travel, you know, whether you're in Finland or the south of Italy, I mean, this couldn't be anywhere else. And so now wait, I've lost my train of thought.
No, I was...
no, I'm sorry, because I go off on tangents.
You said that Europe is not as wonderful as...
No, oh, yeah, I mean, Europe could, but also Europe invented these universal healthcare systems, education for every child up to the age of 16 or beyond, fantastically good universities, and this since the Middle Ages. I mean, we did this before anybody else. We were the first to have real revolutions, which brought in not only semi-democratic governments, but also all the rights that we talked about, but also a change in cultures. It brought museums, it brought theater to the people, it brought all kinds of activities that people could participate in for the first time. It took people out of serfdom. The number of people who were able to leave the absolute lowest level of subsistence and survival has been phenomenal in Europe. And I used to think, and I still do to some degree, that Europe could be a kind of beacon to the rest of the world and say, look, it can be done. Yes, you need to grow, but you do it by making people more equal than they were before the revolutions. You bring people more together, you tax the rich, you redistribute, you make jobs accessible for everyone, you make education accessible to everyone, and you'll see, you will have a society which will thrive, but you have to invest in the future. What's happening now is we are preventing so many countries from investing in the future, including this one, that this is tragic. It's absolutely tragic. And in France, when these young people were asked in a poll, what would you label your generation? You know, there's Generation X and there's the generation of the baby boomers, and they said, the majority said, we're the sacrificed generation. And that's terrible when you're 18 or 19 to say that we're the sacrificed generation, but they do feel that. And this I cannot pardon the European authorities or the governmental authorities.
You've mentioned that if the tax cross-border transaction would have been established all over Europe, we will have money enough to cover the welfare state.
Well, not just with that, not just with the transactions tax, but there are 11 countries in Europe.
Who are going to do it now?
Are there 12 now? That said...
No, 11.
There's 11 countries that said they were willing to put this tax into place. Here the Germans have been very good. The Germans have been much better than the French. The French have been terrible. This is another thing François Hollande promised and didn't do. and his finance minister is just pushing as hard as he can to prevent it. And he said, no, but not on derivatives, no, but not on currencies. I mean, come on, we have to tax every financial transaction, and it would not solve every problem, but it would give a lot more freedom. But there's other things you could do. You could say for the debt of a country like Spain, which, by the way, before the crisis had an extremely low public debt. I don't know what it is now. I didn't check before I left.
The public debt here now?
Public debt, it was
Here.
45% before the crisis. That's nothing.
Here?
Yeah.
Now it's about 98%.
Okay, well, but
Just
there
just
you
about
are.
100 in
There
Spain.
you are. Well, there you are. But there's other things you could do. You could say, okay, that debt needs to be audited. We will have a serious audit in Spain of exactly what that debt was taken out for. And if a reasonable committee of expert people who can understand figures and sort it out says that this is debt which was either acquired by Franco's regime, or it was not spent on useful things for the people, or it was spent only on armaments or other unproductive activities, then we are going to label it odious debt, which is not a moral idea, it's a legal idea. Odious debt means, and it's since the 1920s, and many governments have said, Ecuador just had a debt audit a couple of years ago, and they discovered that about a third of their debt was illegitimate. And they said, we're not going to pay it. And they haven't. And nothing happened. I mean, nothing dire happened. Oh, by the way, Ecuador has just been sued by a corporation, a petroleum corporation. This is one of the things that exists in this treaty. I keep trying to say something about
Tell
the
what everyone
the
about
great
that.
market between Europe and...
I will explain to them.
Okay.
Ella està molt interessada en explicar les implicacions del tractat que estan negociant ja els Estats Units i la Unió Europea per tenir un mercat únic. D'acord? I diu, deixa-m'ho explicar, eh? Tell us about it.
Good. Thank you. There is a paragraph in every investment treaty now that is called the Investor to State Dispute Settlement Process. For short, it's ISDS, Investor to State Dispute Settlement. Okay. What this clause says is, if a corporation finds that any government measure or law or decree or whatever at any level, local, regional, national, is going to harm its present or future profits, expected profits in the future, can bring a legal case against the government in front of a private tribunal of arbitration, which will be made up of lawyers, mostly British and American lawyers, and they will decide what compensation, if this is true, is owed to that company. Well, Ecuador was hit by one of these suits by this petroleum, American oil company. And this company wanted to drill for oil in an area which Ecuador said, sorry, it's a national park. You can't drill there. They brought a case, and the arbitrators have just said, okay, you should be paid $1.1 billion. And the government should also pay the costs. The costs are an average of $8 million. But this can happen anywhere if this treaty passes. So it's a cap on any kind of regulation or any kind of government prevention of ills coming from transnational corporations. Now, I've got that a bit off my chest. let's go back to where were we before?
No, but
remind me
to
what
give
we
some
were before.
advice to this, you mentioned earlier this Davos class,
Yeah.
the Davos elite. Here we have a small Davos elite. Each country has its
Sure,
own
we all
Davos
do,
elite,
sure.
right? And which believe that they control the power of their economy, really.
They do.
Spanish, Italian, or whatever.
They do.
But do they control the global? They are organized, or really each one maintains the power of the state to control a small economy because they know that the global economy is controlled only by 150 people within these transnational corporations?
No, they're both. Look at the guest list for Davos, and you will see that the people, there's Spaniards on that list, and those people will both be very active, obviously, in the Spanish economy, but they will also be active in the global economy, and some of them will sit on some of the very large committees like the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, which has prepared this treaty. They will sit on the various chambers of commerce. They will be active in Business Europe, which is a big federation of businesses. It will be both, but in general, their ideology is the one that is influencing governments. We go back here to what we were saying before about the Gramscian, how do you get people to think the way you're thinking? Well, take this word competitivity. It wasn't even in the dictionary 20 years ago. Competitivity. These two presidents, Jean-Louis Beffa, who is was the president of Saint-Gobain, and his friend from Germany, Mr. Gerhard Krumm, who is, I think it's Siemens and Thyssen, whatever. And they wrote this report, and Angela Merkel invites them with François Hollande. They present it to François Hollande. This is the report about competitivity. And these two guys from these transnationals say, this is what we need, and we have to cut labor costs, and we have... Nobody ever asks, what are the costs of capital? But everybody is interested in what is the cost of labor. Capital costs a lot, because dividends have gone up so much over the past 20 years that the capital sector is receiving 10 points of GDP more than it received 30 years ago. So now all the French government can talk about is competitivity. And what they mean by that is exactly what these two guys wrote in their report. This is how you change people's heads.
But we are all trained.
Competitivity is a lie. Look, I mean, let's say Catalonia wants to leave Spain and wants to leave Europe or whatever. You're going to be in competition with absolutely everything in the world.
Like the
Bosnia, I don't know.
Like the Denmark or...
Yeah, no, worse than Denmark, because Denmark will still be... No, I mean, this idea of competitivity, that would be okay, in my view anyway. It would be okay if it were Europe saying, okay, we have 500 million people. There are a certain number of things we don't want to allow in. We are going to favor certain industries until they are strong enough to compete on the world market. And we think that 500 million people is a pretty good market, and that, okay, we can have
7.5, in fact.
Yeah, all right. We can have some, we'll have competition, but we're not going to be in competition with the whole world. That you could do that.
But there's many small countries that live with healthy economies.
Yes.
And survive within this global world, like Switzerland.
Of course. That's true.
They can survive even if they are small, if they have proper political economies. I mean.
Well, perhaps they've developed particular advantages. Once more, I'm not an economist. And I'm not saying Catalonia couldn't survive. But let's say how you could do it. If you decided, for instance, let's say you leave and you want to be you want to be self-sufficient, and you don't want to have to depend on borrowing from Spain or the IMF or whoever. You could say, okay, we're going to become the most ecological country in the world. We are going to make a huge transition. Everything is going to be invested in that. We're going to have special institutes. The educational system will be fixed to do. We've got plenty of people who know how to build buildings. We'll tell them how to. They will now, from now on, every building will be refitted. Every building will be, proofed for energy, will be neutral in energy, and some of them will produce energy, which can go to the grid, etc. That could be a specialty. You could make a reputation on that, and you could be the place that was able to do that and have a quality of life. I'm not saying this is impossible. I think it would be very chaotic if it happened, because the ties are so infinite that, and I don't know which ones would be broken, and that's
so you
not.
claim for.
I'd rather. I mean, it's my own fault because I
yeah.
dropped into the trap of talking about
but
it.
you claim for a real debate on the consequences of this.
Of course. No, I mean it would be foolhardy. No, what I said before was I think it's absolutely legitimate to demand a referendum and say, what do the people think? We won't know until we ask them. And have a real debate about the pros and the cons. There's bound to be very good arguments on both sides. And then everyone should decide on the strength of that. And then once you have the referendum, then the debate should continue for quite a while before any drastic measures are taken, because things can change very fast now in Europe. But that we can maybe close that subject.
Okay. What's happening in the geostrategical of this global economy? We've seen like the Ukrainian conflict now, and all of a sudden everybody goes on what's going to happen if Russia
invades Crimea. Or annexes
Crimea, which have done already.
Yeah.
And this will create global economical problems, because the European Union and the United States will sort of establish the new rules with Russia. That can cause problems to this global economy.
I wish I knew more about Ukraine, but what I think I can say is that in Ukraine, at the moment, there is no coherent solution on the left. You're either going to get the neoliberal right, or you're going to get the hardcore fascist right. Because in a country which was under communism, and we have in the Soviet Union style, and we've seen this all over Eastern Europe, anything that sounds left or sounds socialist even, to them that means that's the regime we had before, and they don't want it, and they're quite right not to want it. But there is no, or very tiny groups, but nothing resembling a political party, that says, no, the left doesn't have to be that. The left can go along with the freedoms that, the freedoms of the Enlightenment that we started out with. And we don't have to be, it's not going to be regimented, and it's not going to be the commissars, and the Politburo isn't going to be deciding. It'll be a democratic, socialist approach. We will have the possibility to create cooperatives, but they will be voluntary cooperatives. We won't have a command economy. This does not exist. So, of course, there are going to be geopolitical problems, because the country is very divided, and it's very ethnically divided. And the Crimea, apparently, if they have a referendum, which would be the best solution, at least to say, do they want to be annexed by Russia? Or you could ask a different sort of question. You could say, would you like to have a certain amount of more autonomy, which would probably be a better solution, not be annexed, because that. And then, of course, you have to solve
the presence of the Russian
sure.
military forces.
Yes, sure. I mean, the fleet is already on the coast, right off the. So, I'm not well informed enough on that question to go any further with that.
Susan, let me put you a last question. You are hopeful that social organizations will manage to put their voices
They'll
across.
be part of the pressure that will force governments. They will be a very important part of the pressure that will force governments to change policies.
Can you imagine a global strike in Europe from these social movements?
Not yet.
But there's a path in there to say to the governments, look, we cannot stand that anymore. We need solutions. A global European strike would
It's a beautiful idea. It's a beautiful idea. Look, what does exist, this capacity to have a global strike does not exist yet, or a European-wide strike doesn't exist yet. And I don't see the European Confederation of Trade Unions organizing that. But what does exist is something, it's very small, it's very embryonic. I was with them yesterday in Brussels. It's called the Alter Summit. And it was developed by people who agree that...
Last tablet and we are finished.
No, but it's because I don't want to cough in people's ears. That we all agree that the one-country solution may work for some things, but for changing European policies, it doesn't. We spoke about that before.
Yeah.
So the idea is to bring together social movements, trade unions, feminists, ecologists, people from very different kinds of central interest movements, bring them together, economists also, bring them together, let them get to know each other, and then do common activities. So we have about 200 organizations from all over. The Indignados are now cooperating with this. They're kind of anarchistic, so they don't say we have an organization, but they send observers. The Blockupy movement in Germany is there. Sympathizers are some of the very large unions in Germany, like IG Metall and Verdi, the services union. They don't say we'll be full members, but they're coming closer. The European Trade Union Confederation comes as an observer. We have this year decided, and this was a democratic decision, that the three most important things for our work this year will be, one, the treaty, the US-EU treaty, two, the rise of the far right, which our Greek comrades and many others from Eastern Europe are extremely worried about, and the other is austerity. And so those all fit together, actually, because austerity is giving a big boost to the far right, and the treaty is going to make things worse, etc. So this is, I mean, it really is, but we're too weak to say we'll have a whole program that's 40 pages long. And no, that's what we're going to work on. So we'll see how this develops. What is happening is that because people are so preoccupied with their individual situations and their national situation, and this is quite, it's human. I mean, how can you be anything else when it's happening to you every day and more things are coming down on you? And I understand this perfectly, but this is also the beginning, I hope, of something which will recognize that there's another dimension to politics which we've now got to accept. We now have to recognize that about 80% of all the legislation that's put in place in our countries is coming from Europe, that the Troika is a European creation, largely German, yes, but not entirely. Lots of people hide behind Germany, too. That if we don't come together as Europeans, they are already very well organized, and they have come together against us. And so this is the kind of thing that I think can be helpful, that I I have joined. I spend as much time on it as I can. And it's the sort of thing that I see as, yes, it's small, it isn't what we need yet, but that's how everything started. That's how the anti-slavery movement started. That's how the feminist movement began. That's why women can vote now. That's why there's 2 women here talking tonight and not a couple of men. I mean, it would be fine if it was a couple of men too, and you got, but you know, I'm saying that the environmental battle is still not, we haven't won it yet, because this is another thing which is, it's too big for a lot of people to embrace. The whole, you know, it's the whole planet. It's very hard to say, okay, I'll work in an area which is quite beyond me. I'm never going to know everything about it. But to me, this is a very hopeful sign. And as I said before, I see people, every time I go to meetings, I see people who are working in the most extraordinary things and doing really wonderful work to emancipate us. The history of human emancipation is not over. I mean, you know, we can't, good Lord, that's impossible to imagine. People don't behave that way. People also want to share. We're much better off cooperating than competing. People sense that. They don't want this kind of a universe forced upon them, and I don't think they'll accept it. What I hope is that we can do it non-violently.
Hopefully.
Don't know, hopefully.
Hopefully. I think this last statement is the best way to finish this conversation with you, Susan George. It was an immense pleasure.
For me too. Thank you. You're a
wonderful
wonderful
having
interviewer.
you here.
You've done your homework.
Thank
the
you very
audience has. We decided.
Us ho heu passat bé? Ella pregunta. Ens tornem a trobar dijous que ve. Saskia Sassen s'asseurà aquí on ara és Susan George. Jo crec que la mirada de Saskia Sassen sobre com organitzar, com ens podem organitzar, sobretot ella ha estudiat molt bé el que les grans metròpolis poden aportar, justament linkant i vinculant a alguns dels arguments que avui ens ha exposat Susan George. Gràcies per ser aquí. Fins dijous.
Thanks very much.